England, 1816. They say freedom has a price. I discovered that sometimes that price is being kidnapped by the most feared man in Regency England. I, Lyra Ashcroft, never imagined that my escape attempt would place me in the hands of the Ice Duke, that my rebellion against an arranged marriage would imprison me in the mansion of the man everyone feared, that my captor would become my greatest challenge and my greatest temptation. But what I truly didn't know is that sometimes the best choice is the one we never planned to make. This is the story of a woman who fled the prison of duty, only to discover that true captivity could set her heart free, and that the coldest duke in England harboured a warmth no one dared imagine. But before we dive into this story that defied all the conventions of London society, tell me, from which corner of the world are you watching? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. Truth is always more fascinating than fiction. I had planned my escape with the precision of a military general and the desperation of a woman with everything to lose. Every detail had been considered. The small bag packed with only essentials, the jewellery carefully selected for maximum resale value, the route mapped to the nearest coaching inn. What I had not planned for, in all my careful calculations, was the Duke of Valerius himself standing between me and my freedom. But I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Lyra Ashcroft, and until that fateful night, I had been perfectly content in my unremarkable existence. I enjoyed my books, my long walks through the countryside, and the occasional scandal of speaking my mind at dinner parties where young ladies were expected to smile and nod. My father, a baron of modest means and immodest debts, had tolerated my eccentricities with the weary patience of a man who knew his daughter's sharp tongue was the least of his problems. Then came the announcement that would change everything. I was to marry Julian Valerius, nephew and heir to the Duke of Valerius. It was, my father assured me with barely concealed relief, an extraordinary match. The Valerius family possessed wealth that made our modest estate look like a gardener's cottage, and Julian himself was reportedly handsome, educated and perfectly amiable. And that precisely was the problem. Julian was perfectly everything, perfectly polite, perfectly boring, perfectly content to marry a woman he had met exactly twice, both times in chaperoned drawing rooms where our conversation never progressed beyond discussions of weather and the surprisingly tedious subject of his collection of ancient coins. He did not ask what I thought about anything of consequence. He did not seem to notice when I deliberately quoted philosophers he had clearly never read. He simply smiled that pleasant, empty smile and agreed with everything I said. I would rather have married a bookshelf. At least a bookshelf might offer interesting reading. So I decided to run. Not away from Julian specifically. How can one run from someone so insubstantial? But toward something more. Toward choice. Toward a life where I might matter as more than a decorative wife whose primary function was to nod approvingly at dinner parties and produce appropriate airs. The night before my wedding, I waited until the household fell silent. My heart hammered so violently I was certain it would wake the entire estate. With shaking hands, I lowered my small bag from the window, climbed down the trellis I had tested days before, and ran. The night was cold and clear. The moon bright enough to light my way, but not so bright as to make me conspicuous. Every snap of a twig made me freeze. Every distant sound sent my imagination into panic. But I pressed forward, following the road that would take me to the coaching inn, to the morning mail coach, to anywhere but the church where I was expected to promise my life to pleasant, forgettable Julian. I had covered perhaps 2 miles, not nearly far enough I knew with growing dread, when I saw it. A carriage, elegant and expensive, blocking the road ahead as if it had been waiting specifically for me. My blood turned to ice. For one absurd moment I considered running into the woods, but before I could move, the carriage door opened with deliberate slowness, and he emerged. I knew who he was immediately. Everyone in England knew the Duke of Valerius, at least by reputation. The Ice Duke, they called him, though never to his face. A man who had inherited his title at 22 after his brother's sudden death, and who had proceeded to manage the vast Valerius holdings with ruthless efficiency and absolutely no warmth whatsoever. He was said to be brilliant, inflexible, and utterly incapable of tolerating chaos or disorder of any kind. In short, he was exactly the wrong person to discover a runaway bride on a moonlit road. He stepped down from the carriage with a grace that seemed almost predatory. and even in the dim light, I could see him clearly. Tall, aristocratic features, dark hair that looked severely controlled even at this hour, and eyes, heaven help me those eyes, that seemed to catalogue every detail of my dishevelled appearance in seconds. His evening clothes were impeccable despite the late hour, as if disorder dared not touch even his wardrobe. He did not shout, did not appear angry, or even particularly surprised. He simply looked at me, at my practical travelling dress, my small bag, my wind-blown hair, and something that might have been amusement crossed his austere features. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed simply because it had never encountered meaningful resistance. He informed me, with devastating calm, that my attempt at escape had been anticipated, that my father, knowing my rebellious tendencies, had requested the Duke's assistance in ensuring the wedding proceeded as planned, that I had, in my haste to flee my future husband, managed to run directly into the arms of his considerably less tolerant uncle. And then came the words that sealed my fate. I would not be returned to my father's house. I would not be given another opportunity to flee. Instead, I would accompany him to his own estate, where I would remain until the wedding ceremony, thereby ensuring that no further embarrassment befell the Valerius name. I was being kidnapped by my future husband's uncle, to ensure I did not escape my own wedding. The irony would have been amusing if I were not so terrified. I tried to argue, of course. I informed him with all the dignity I could muster while standing dishevelled on a dark road, that he had no legal right to detain me, that this was outrageous, unprecedented, and possibly criminal, that I refused absolutely to cooperate with this absurd plan. He listened to my entire speech with that same infuriating calm, then simply gestured to the carriage. My choice, he said with a politeness that somehow made it worse, was to enter willingly or to be assisted by his coachman. Either way, I would be leaving this road in his carriage within the next 2 minutes. I looked at his face, that perfect, cold, aristocratic face, and knew with sinking certainty that he meant every word. This was not a man who made empty threats. This was a man who stated facts and expected reality to arrange itself accordingly. I entered the carriage. As the door closed behind me and the vehicle lurched into motion, I caught one final glimpse of the Duke's face through the window. In the moonlight, his expression was unreadable, carved from marble and duty, and absolute certainty in the rightness of his actions. I had fled one prison only to find myself in another, this one guarded by the most inflexible man in England. The journey to my new captivity had begun. The journey to Valerius Manor took 3 hours that felt like 3 days. I sat in rigid silence across from the Duke, who had settled into his seat with the casual elegance of a man entirely comfortable with his decisions, however outrageous they might be. He did not attempt conversation, did not offer explanations or justifications beyond what he had already stated on that moonlit road. He simply sat there, occasionally glancing at documents he had produced from a leather case, as if kidnapping his nephew's bride was merely another item on his list of daily responsibilities. I, meanwhile, cycled through every emotion available to a woman in my impossible situation. Rage came first, hot and righteous and utterly useless against a man who seemed impervious to any form of protest. Then fear, cold and creeping, as I contemplated what exactly my captivity might entail. And finally, most disturbing of all, a strange sort of curiosity about the man who could orchestrate such an audacious plan with the same calm efficiency one might apply to organising a dinner party. When we finally arrived, dawn was breaking over the countryside, painting the sky in shades of grey and pink that seemed far too lovely for such a grim occasion. Valerius Manor rose before us like something from a Gothic novel, all imposing stone and severe architecture, with none of the welcoming warmth one might hope for in a country estate. It was beautiful in the way a mountain is beautiful, magnificent, impressive, and utterly indifferent to human comfort. The Duke descended first and offered his hand to assist me from the carriage. I considered refusing out of pure spite, but my legs were stiff from the journey and I had no desire to add a graceless tumble to my list of humiliations. His grip was firm and brief, releasing me the moment my feet touched solid ground. A severe-looking housekeeper appeared at the entrance, and the Duke issued instructions with that same measured efficiency. I was to be shown to the blue room. I was to be provided with everything necessary for my comfort. I was to be treated as an honoured guest, with one small exception. I was not, under any circumstances, to leave the property. An honoured guest, a prisoner with good linens apparently. The blue room, I discovered, was actually quite lovely despite its misleading name, decorated in soft greens and creams rather than blue, with large windows overlooking the estate's extensive grounds. It was also, I noted with sinking realization, on the 3rd floor, with a view that confirmed any escape attempt would result in broken bones at minimum. The Duke, it seemed, had planned for every contingency. I spent the first day in a fury of restless energy, pacing the room like a caged animal and mentally cataloguing every possible means of escape. By the 2nd day, boredom began to set in alongside the anger. The housekeeper brought meals that I barely touched. The maids who came to tend the fire would not meet my eyes, clearly instructed to maintain professional distance from the household's unusual prisoner. On the 3rd morning, I decided that if I was to be imprisoned, I would at least not suffer quietly. I dressed in my most presentable gown. One must maintain standards even in captivity, and marched downstairs with the firm intention of confronting my captor. I found him naturally in what the housekeeper had mentioned was his study, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, looking as impeccably put together as if it were not barely past breakfast. He glanced up when I entered without knocking, and one dark eyebrow rose in what might have been surprise or disapproval or perhaps simple acknowledgement. It was impossible to tell with him. I informed him, with all the dignity I could command, that this situation was intolerable, that I refused to spend the next week locked in a lovely room like some sort of decorative prisoner, that if he insisted on this ridiculous arrangement I would at least require access to a proper library, as I would surely lose my mind with nothing but embroidery to occupy my time. He listened to this entire speech without interruption, his expression unreadable. Then, with what I was beginning to recognize as his characteristic economy of words, he informed me that I was welcome to use the library, that, in fact, I was welcome to move freely about the house and grounds, so long as I did not attempt to leave the property. That confinement to my room had never been part of his plan. I had confined myself. I stared at him, momentarily robbed of speech by the realization that I had spent 3 days furiously pacing a room I could have left at any time. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his austere features, gone so quickly I might have imagined it. He gestured to the door with one elegant hand, suggesting that the library was 2 doors down if I cared to make use of it. I left his study with as much dignity as I could, muster which was considerably less than I had entered with, and found the library exactly where he had indicated. And what a library it was! Floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with volumes that made my heart leap despite my circumstances. Philosophy, history, poetry, the latest novels from London. I found works by Mary Wollstonecraft that my father would have been scandalized to know I had read, and political treatises that most men assumed were too complex for female comprehension. This was not the library of a man who merely collected books for show. This was the library of someone who actually read them. I lost myself for hours in those shelves, and when the housekeeper appeared to inform me that dinner would be served in the dining room, I was surprised to find the afternoon had vanished entirely. The dining room presented a new dilemma. The Duke sat at the head of a table that could have seated 20, and a place had been set for me at his right. The message was clear. I would not be dining in isolation like a proper prisoner, but neither would I be permitted to pretend he did not exist. I took my seat and prepared for awkward silence. Instead, he asked what I had thought of the library. The question surprised me enough that I answered honestly. It was the finest private collection I had ever seen. He acknowledged this with a slight nod and asked if I had found anything of interest. I mentioned the political essays I had been reading, expecting dismissal or patronizing surprise that a woman would concern herself with such topics. Instead, he asked my opinion on the author's central argument, and just like that we were debating political philosophy over roasted pheasant and wine. He did not condescend, did not simplify or explain as if I were a child requiring instruction. When I made a point he disagreed with, he challenged it directly, forcing me to defend my position with logic rather than emotion. When I caught him in a contradiction, he acknowledged it. With the same calm he applied to everything else, then adjusted his argument accordingly. It was the most intellectually stimulating conversation I had experienced in years. As the meal concluded and I returned to my room, I found myself in a state of profound confusion. I was a prisoner in this house, held here against my will by a man who had literally kidnapped me to prevent my escape. I should have been plotting revenge, or escape, or at minimum maintaining a posture of hostile silence. Instead, I found myself looking forward to the next time I might argue with the Duke of Valerius about philosophy and politics. The realization was deeply troubling. Over the following days, a routine established itself. I spent mornings in the library, reading whatever caught my interest. Afternoons I walked the grounds, always aware of the subtle presence of groundskeepers who ensured I did not stray beyond the property boundaries. And evenings brought those dinners where the Duke and I engaged in debates that grew more animated with each passing day. I began to notice things. The way his austere expression softened almost imperceptibly when he was pleased with a particular argument. How he would pause before responding to a challenging question, giving it genuine consideration rather than reflexive dismissal. The small scar near his left eyebrow that I learned from a gossipy maid he had acquired defending his younger brother from bullies at school. He was still my captor, still the man who had stolen my freedom to preserve his family's honour, still impossibly arrogant in his certainty that he had the right to make such decisions. But he was also brilliant, well-read, and I was beginning to suspect far more complex than the Ice Duke reputation suggested. On the 7th evening of my captivity, as we debated the merits of parliamentary reform, I caught myself laughing at something wryly observant he had said about politicians and their relationship with truth. The sound surprised us both. His eyes met mine across the table, and for just a moment something shifted. The careful distance he maintained seemed to waver, and I saw something in his expression I had not seen before, a flicker of genuine warmth, quickly suppressed but unmistakably present. I excused myself shortly after, claiming fatigue, and fled to my room with my heart beating far too quickly. This was dangerous. Whatever was developing between us, this intellectual connection, this growing ease in each other's company, it was dangerous and foolish and completely inappropriate. I was supposed to marry his nephew in a matter of days, and I was beginning to forget why I had wanted to escape in the first place. The shift in our dynamic happened so gradually that I almost failed to notice it until I was already caught in its current. What had begun as hostile captivity had transformed into something I had no adequate words to describe. We were not friends. The circumstances precluded anything so simple. Yet we were no longer strictly captor and prisoner either. We had become something else entirely. Two people discovering they understood each other in ways that were both exhilarating and deeply inconvenient. The library became our neutral territory, the place where the strange rules governing the rest of the house seemed not to apply. I would settle into my favourite chair by the window with whatever book had captured my interest, and often within an hour the Duke would appear. He never announced himself, never asked permission to join me. He would simply select his own volume and take the chair opposite mine, and we would read in companionable silence broken only by the occasional rustle of turning pages or the crackling of the fire. Sometimes one of us would read a passage aloud, a particularly striking argument, a lovely turn of phrase, and it would spark a discussion that stretched for hours. I discovered that Kaelen Valerius, beneath that facade of aristocratic coldness, possessed a subtle wit that caught me off guard more than once. He had a way of delivering observations so dryly that it took a moment to recognize the humour buried within them. And I noticed, heaven help me, I noticed, that when I made him almost smile, that tiny quirk at the corner of his mouth, I felt an absurd flush of triumph entirely disproportionate to the accomplishment. It was during one of these library sessions that I learned something unexpected about my captor. A violent summer storm had rolled in without warning, the kind that turns afternoon into premature twilight and rattles the windows with wind and rain. I had been so absorbed in my reading that I had not noticed the changing weather until thunder cracked overhead, loud enough to make me jump. The Duke glanced up from his own book, and I thought I detected concern in his expression before his usual composed mask returned. He suggested, in that measured way of his, that perhaps I might prefer to return to my room before the storm worsened. The roads would be dangerous, he added, and travel inadvisable until morning. I looked at him with confusion. We were already inside. Why would the condition of the roads matter to me? He blinked, and for the first time since I had known him, Kaelen Valerius looked distinctly uncomfortable. He recovered quickly, returning his attention to his book with perhaps more focus than the text warranted. But I had seen it. A moment of vulnerability. A crack in the ice. I did not return to my room. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, pretending to read while covertly watching him. He seemed tense in a way I had not observed before, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping, the book with more force than necessary. When the next crack of thunder came, I saw him flinch. Barely, anyone not watching closely would have missed it, but I saw. The Duke of Valerius, the man known throughout England for his unshakable composure, was unsettled by thunderstorms. I should have pretended not to notice. The kind thing, the polite thing, would have been to allow him his dignity, but I had never been particularly skilled at doing the expected thing. So instead, I asked him about it. Gently, with none of my usual argumentative edge, I asked if storms bothered him. The look he gave me suggested he was considering whether to deny it entirely or have me removed from the library. But after a long moment, he set his book aside and told me the truth. His brother, Julian's father, had died during a storm, not from the storm itself, but the timing had been unfortunate. A riding accident on rain-slicked roads, and by the time Kaelen had reached him, it was too late. He had held his dying brother in the mud and rain, thunder rolling overhead, helpless to do anything but watch life slip away. Since then, storms brought back that night with uncomfortable clarity. He related this in his characteristic measured tones, as if discussing weather patterns or crop rotations rather than a memory that clearly haunted him. But his hands, I noticed, were no longer quite steady. I found myself doing something entirely unplanned. I moved from my chair to sit on the ottoman nearer to his, close enough that our knees nearly touched, and I simply stayed there. I did not offer empty platitudes or reach out to touch him. I suspected he would have found either gesture unbearable. I simply made myself present, a silent acknowledgement that he did not have to carry that memory alone in this moment. We sat that way as the storm raged outside, and I read passages aloud from the book in my lap. Nothing profound or particularly relevant, just words to fill the space between, thunder cracks, to give him something to focus on beyond his memories. He listened without comment, his breathing gradually evening out, the tension slowly leaving his shoulders. When the storm finally passed, he looked at me with an expression I could not quite decipher. There was surprise there, certainly, but also something that looked almost like gratitude, and underneath that, something warmer that made my breath catch. He thanked me, simply and quietly, in a voice that held more genuine emotion than I had ever heard from him. I returned to my chair, my heart doing complicated things in my chest, and we resumed our reading as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed, and we both knew it. After that evening, the walls between us began to crumble in earnest. He asked about my life before the arranged marriage, and I found myself telling him things I had told no one else. How I had always felt like a poorly fitting piece in a puzzle, too opinionated for polite society, too restless for the quiet country life expected of me. How I had feared not the marriage itself, but the slow death of becoming someone smaller, quieter, less myself. And he, in turn, shared pieces of himself I suspected few people ever saw. The weight of responsibility he had carried since his brother's death, becoming guardian to Julian while still grieving and barely more than a boy himself. The loneliness of being the Duke everyone feared and no one truly knew. The way duty had become both his purpose and his prison. I began to understand that perhaps we were not so different, he and I. Both trapped by circumstances and expectations. Both longing for something more, even if we could not name what that something was. Our evening debates took on a different quality. Less about winning arguments, and more about genuine exchange of ideas. He challenged me to think more deeply, and I challenged him to feel more freely. We balanced each other in ways that should not have worked, but somehow did. And then came the night that changed everything. I had woken from a nightmare not unusual for me. Vivid dreams had plagued me since childhood, but this one left me shaken and unable to return to sleep. Rather than lie awake in the darkness, I wrapped a shawl around my nightdress and made my way to the library, thinking a book might settle my nerves. I was not expecting to find him there, sitting in the dark by the dying fire, still fully dressed despite the late hour. He looked up when I entered, and I saw my own sleeplessness reflected in his eyes. Neither of us questioned the other's presence or suggested we should return to our rooms. Instead, I took my usual chair, and he stirred the fire back to life, and we sat together in the quiet darkness. This time, he was the one who broke the silence. He asked what I had been dreaming about, and I told him. A nightmare about being trapped in a room that grew smaller and smaller, walls closing in until I could not breathe. The symbolism was not particularly subtle. He was quiet for a long moment, then spoke of his own recurring dream. In it, he was always arriving too late, to his brother's accident, to crises at his estates, to moments that mattered, always running, always failing, always bound by duty to do the impossible and blamed when he inevitably fell short. We sat with these confessions between us, and I realized we were seeing each other, truly seeing each other, for perhaps the first time. Not captor and prisoner, not duke and future niece by marriage, but simply Kaelen and Lyra, two people who understood what it meant to feel trapped by circumstances beyond their control. I am not certain which of us moved first, but somehow my hand found his in the space between our chairs. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid and real, and neither of us pulled away. We stayed that way until dawn began to lighten the windows, talking about everything and nothing, sharing the kind of conversation that happens only in the vulnerable hours between midnight and morning. And when we finally parted, his fingers reluctant to release mine, I knew with absolute certainty that something profound had shifted between us. I was falling for my captor, for the man who had stolen my freedom, who held me here against my will, who represented everything I should resist. And the truly terrifying part was that I suspected he might be falling for me too. The morning after our night in the library, I woke with the disorienting sensation that the world had tilted slightly off its axis. Everything looked the same, the familiar ceiling of the blue room, the soft morning light filtering through the curtains, the sounds of the household beginning its daily routines. Yet nothing felt the same at all. I had crossed some invisible line in the darkness, and there was no crossing back. I dressed with unusual care, telling myself it had nothing to do with the possibility of seeing him at breakfast. I failed to convince even myself. He was already in the breakfast room when I arrived, reading the morning papers with his usual absorbed concentration. But when I entered, he looked up immediately, and our eyes met for a fraction of a second too long. Something passed between us in that moment, acknowledgement perhaps, or shared memory of confessions made in firelight. Then he returned his attention to his newspaper, and I busied myself with selecting breakfast items I had no appetite for. We did not speak of the previous night. There seemed to be an unspoken agreement that what had been shared in darkness would remain there too fragile and dangerous to examine in daylight. Instead, we discussed utterly mundane topics, the weather, a letter he had received from an associate in London, whether I had finished the book I had been reading. It should have felt like a retreat to safer ground. Instead, it felt like we were both very carefully not mentioning the elephant that had taken up residence in the room. The day proceeded normally enough. I spent my morning in the library, though I found concentration unusually difficult. Every sound in the hallway made me look up, hoping and fearing in equal measure that it might be him. When he did appear shortly before noon, my heart performed an acrobatic feat that had no business occurring over someone simply entering a room. He had come, he explained, to retrieve a specific volume on estate management, a perfectly reasonable errand that required absolutely no explanation, yet he had offered one anyway. I watched him locate the book, noted the way his hands moved with unconscious grace, and realized with dawning horror that I was noticing entirely too many details about the Duke of Valerius. Then came the afternoon that shattered my remaining illusions about my own emotional state. I had been walking in the garden. The weather had turned fine, with the kind of clear sky that made the previous night's confessions feel like something from a dream. I had wandered farther than usual toward the boundary of the property, where a low stone wall marked the edge of the Duke's domain. I was not attempting escape, merely seeking air and space to sort through the tangle of my thoughts. I did not realize Kaelen had business in one of the outbuildings nearby, or that he would be meeting with an associate there. I heard their voices before I saw them, and something in the more associate's tone, condescending, dismissive, made me slow my steps. The man was speaking about me, suggesting with the casual cruelty of someone who believed himself among allies that the Duke had been too lenient with his rebellious charge, that I clearly required a firmer hand, more restrictions, perhaps even punishment for my attempted flight, that once the marriage to Julian was accomplished, the boy would need to establish dominance early, or I would walk all over him as I apparently did with everyone else. He laughed as he said this, as if my personhood was a joke to be shared between men of the world. I should have left, should have returned to the house before my presence was detected, avoided the embarrassment of being caught eavesdropping. But I found myself rooted to the spot, waiting to hear how Kaelen would respond to this assessment of my character and the advice on how to handle me. His response, when it came, was delivered in a voice so cold it could have frozen the summer air between them. He informed the man with devastating precision that I was not a horse to be broken or a dog to be trained, that I was an intelligent woman with thoughts and opinions that deserved respect, not a problem requiring a firm hand, that any man who could not see my wit, courage, and independence as assets rather than flaws was a fool who did not deserve to be in the same room with me, let alone presume to offer advice about my management. Furthermore, he continued with barely controlled anger. I had shown more genuine strength of character in my attempted escape than most of the so-called gentlemen of the ton showed in their entire comfortable lives. That my refusal to meekly accept a fate I had no hand in choosing was precisely the kind of spirit England would benefit from seeing more often, particularly among its women. The associate stammered something about merely trying to be helpful, about not meaning offence. Kaelen cut him off with words so sharp I could practically see them slicing through the air. He suggested, with Arctic politeness, that the meeting was concluded and the man should see himself out immediately. I stood behind the garden wall, my hand pressed to my mouth, my heart thundering so loudly I was certain it would give away my presence. But they did not come in my direction. I heard the associate's hasty departure, and then silence. I should have left then, should have returned to the house and pretended I had heard nothing. Instead, I remained frozen, processing what I had just witnessed. Kaelen Valerius, the Duke of Ice, had defended me with a passion I had never heard from him, had seen me, truly seen me, in ways that no one else ever had, not as a problem or a burden or a willful girl requiring correction, but as a person of value exactly as I was. When I finally returned to the house, my legs unsteady beneath me, I found him in his study. He looked up when I entered, and something in my expression must have betrayed me because his eyes narrowed slightly in concern. I told him I had been in the garden, that I had overheard his conversation, that I probably should apologize for eavesdropping, though I found I could not quite summon the regret necessary for a proper apology. A flush crept up his neck, the first time I had seen the composed Duke actually blush. He stood, looking distinctly uncomfortable, and began to say something about the man being an insufferable bore whose opinions were worth less than the paper they might be written on. I stopped him, told him that what he had said, his defence of me, his recognition of who I was, meant more than he could possibly know, that no one had ever spoken of me that way, that I had spent my entire life being told I was too much or not enough, too opinionated or too unfeminine, and here he was telling a stranger that my rebellious nature was something to be valued rather than suppressed. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and the careful distance he had been maintaining since our night in the library crumbled entirely. His voice, when he spoke, was rougher than usual, lacking its characteristic control. He told me that anyone who could not see my worth was blind, that my spirit was not something to be broken, but something to be celebrated, that Julian was a decent enough young man but would never fully appreciate the extraordinary woman he was supposed to marry. The air between us felt charged with something dangerous and thrilling. We stood there in his study with the door still half open, closer than we should be but not yet touching, and the truth hung between us like a physical presence. I was not imagining this. Whatever was growing between us was real and mutual and completely impossible. He seemed to realize it at the same moment I did. His expression shifted, and I watched him rebuild those walls, brick by careful brick, until the Duke of Ice stood before me once more. He excused himself, citing urgent correspondence that could not wait. I left his study with my heart in chaos, knowing that something fundamental had changed and that there was no path forward that did not lead to heartbreak. That evening at dinner, we were exquisitely polite to each other, discussing nothing of consequence, maintaining perfect propriety. But I caught him watching me when he thought I was focused on my plate, and he surely noticed the way my breath caught when our fingers accidentally brushed reaching for the same serving dish. When I retired to my room that night, I stood at my window looking out over the grounds that had become both my prison and, bewilderingly, something like home. In a few short days I would be married to Julian. I would leave this house and likely never see Kaelen again, except at awkward family gatherings where we would pretend we barely knew each other. The thought was unbearable. I had come to this house as a prisoner, desperate to escape. Now I found myself dreading the day of my release because it would mean leaving behind the one person who had ever truly understood me. I had fallen in love with my captor, with the impossible, inflexible, brilliant man who held me here against my will, but had somehow given me a freedom I had never known, the freedom to be entirely myself, sharp edges and stubborn spirit and all. And I had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The wedding was now only 3 days away, and the knowledge sat between Kaelen and me like a third presence at every meal, every accidentally shared glance, every careful conversation about nothing that mattered. The house had taken on the quality of a place holding its breath, waiting for an inevitable conclusion that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge aloud. I noticed the change in him first. The Duke of Ice was reasserting himself with a vengeance, as if he could freeze out the warmth that had developed between us through sheer force of will. Our morning encounters became briefer, his responses more clipped. He stopped joining me in the library altogether, and our dinners, once the highlight of my confined days, became exercises in polite distance that left me feeling more alone than I had in the first days of my captivity. He was rebuilding his walls, and he was doing it thoroughly. I told myself I understood. I even told myself I approved. This impossible thing between us could go nowhere, and the sooner we both accepted that, the less painful the inevitable separation would be. I told myself many reasonable, mature things. None of them made it hurt any less. On the second morning before the wedding, I woke to find the household in a state of heightened activity. Julian would be arriving that afternoon, along with my father and the necessary arrangements for the ceremony. The reality I had been avoiding was descending upon us with the inexorable quality of a closing trap. I dressed with mechanical precision, my hands steady even as my thoughts raced in panicked circles. I would meet my intended husband, the pleasant, forgettable man I was supposed to promise my life to, and I would have to pretend that the past weeks had not fundamentally altered me, that I had not discovered what it felt like to be truly seen and valued and challenged by someone who understood the workings of my mind. I found Kaelen in his study, surrounded by papers related to the wedding arrangements. He looked up when I entered, and for just a moment his carefully controlled expression slipped. I saw exhaustion there and something that looked remarkably like misery before he mastered it. I asked if we might speak. He gestured to the chair across from his desk with the formal politeness one might offer a stranger. I sat and tried to find words for what I needed to say, that I understood why he was distancing himself, that I did not blame him for it, that I was grateful for the weeks we had shared, even if they had made what came next infinitely more difficult, that I would do my duty and marry Julian and try very hard not to think about what might have been. The words came out wrong, stilted and formal, and nothing like what I actually felt. He listened without interruption, his face a mask of aristocratic composure that revealed absolutely nothing. When I finished, he thanked me, as if I had delivered a routine report rather than a poorly disguised goodbye. He assured me that I would be very happy with Julian, that his nephew was a good man who would treat me well, that I would want for nothing as part of the Valerius family. Everything he said was perfectly reasonable and utterly devastating. I left his study with my composure intact but my heart in pieces and retreated to the library, the one place in this house that had become truly mine. I sat in my chair by the window and stared unseeing at the grounds beyond, trying to reconcile myself to a future that stretched ahead like a prison sentence. Julian arrived precisely when expected, because of course he did. Pleasant, punctual, perfectly appropriate Julian, who greeted me with genuine warmth and what appeared to be relief that I had not attempted another escape. He was exactly as I remembered, handsome in a conventional way, well-mannered, educated, and utterly incapable of stirring any feeling in me beyond mild guilt that I could not summon more enthusiasm for our impending union. He spoke of the wedding preparations, of the house we would live in after the ceremony, of his hopes for our marriage, all of it delivered with sincere kindness, and not a single spark of the intellectual fire that I had come to crave from his uncle. I smiled and nodded and said appropriate things and felt like a fraud. Dinner that evening was an exercise in exquisite torture. My father had arrived as well, visibly relieved that his troublesome daughter had been successfully contained until the wedding. He thanked Kaelen profusely for his assistance in ensuring I did not disgrace the family with another escape attempt. Kaelen accepted these thanks with his usual measured grace, never once looking in my direction. Julian, oblivious to any undercurrents, chatted amiably about his plans for our honeymoon trip. He wanted to show me the Lake District, which he assured me was quite lovely this time of year. He hoped I enjoyed walking, as there were excellent trails. Perhaps we might even do some sketching together. Did I sketch? He had recently taken it up as a hobby. I murmured something non-committal about my limited artistic abilities, and caught Kaelen's hand tightening almost imperceptibly around his wineglass. It was the only sign that he was even listening to the conversation. After dinner, Julian requested a private word with me in the drawing room. My father beamed his approval, and I had no reasonable excuse to refuse. We sat in the formal parlour, and he took my hand with earnest gentleness. He told me he understood that our marriage had not been my choice, that he knew I had tried to flee, and he did not hold it against me. He hoped that in time we might develop genuine affection for each other. He would try very hard to make me happy, and he hoped I might try as well. It was a sweet speech, delivered with obvious sincerity. Julian was a good man. He would be a kind husband. We would have a perfectly pleasant life together, and I would spend the rest of my days wondering what it might have been like to marry someone who set my mind on fire the way his uncle did. I told Julian that I appreciated his understanding, that I would do my best to be a good wife to him. The lies came easily now, smooth and practiced. He looked relieved and pressed a chaste kiss to my hand before excusing himself for the evening. He had an early start the next day, final preparations for the ceremony and all that. I remained in the drawing room after he left, staring at the hand he had kissed, and feeling absolutely nothing. I did not hear Kaelen enter. I only became aware of his presence when he spoke from the doorway, his voice carefully neutral as he asked if my conversation with Julian had gone well. I turned to find him watching me with an expression I could not read. We were alone for the first time since Julian's arrival, and the air between us felt heavy with everything we were not saying. I told him the conversation had gone as well as could be expected, that Julian was very kind, that I was certain we would be adequate together. Something flickered across Kaelen's face at that word, adequate, as if I had struck him. He crossed the room with controlled deliberation, stopping a careful distance away, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to maintain propriety. When he spoke, his voice was rough around the edges, the careful control slipping. He asked if adequacy was truly all I wanted from life, if I was prepared to spend my days in pleasant mediocrity with a man who would never challenge me, never truly see the brilliant, infuriating, extraordinary person I was. I stared at him, my heart hammering. This was dangerous territory, and we both knew it. But I found I could not lie. Not to him. Not about this. I told him that no, adequacy was not what I wanted. But sometimes what we want and what we can have are not the same thing. That duty and honour and family obligation mattered, did they not? Surely the Duke of Valerius of all people understood the weight of responsibility and the necessity of putting duty before personal desire. I had meant it as a deflection, a way to redirect the conversation to safer ground. Instead, I watched my words hit him like physical blows. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and it carried more emotion than I had ever heard from him. He told me I was right, that duty mattered, that honour mattered, that he had built his entire life on those principles, that he had taken guardianship of Julian, manage the family estates, maintain the Valerius name and reputation, all because he believed in the importance of responsibility above all else. But somewhere in the past weeks, he had begun to question whether duty served honor, or whether he had been using honor as an excuse to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of actually wanting something for himself. I could barely breathe. We stood there in the drawing room, the door still half open for propriety's sake, and everything I had been trying not to feel rose up and threatened to overwhelm me. Before I could respond, we heard footsteps in the hall. Kaelen stepped back immediately, the distance between us once again appropriate, his expression smoothing into its customary aristocratic neutrality. My father appeared in the doorway, commenting on the late hour and suggesting I retire. I agreed with a calmness I did not feel, bid them both good night, and fled to my room. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake, replaying every word of that devastating conversation, trying to decipher what exactly Kaelen had been trying to tell me, whether his questions about adequacy and duty had been rhetorical, or whether he had been offering me something, some possibility I was too afraid to name. Tomorrow was the final day before my wedding, the last day in this house that had become so much more than my prison, the last day with the man who had changed everything, and I still had no idea what either of us was going to do about it. I woke on the morning before my wedding with the peculiar clarity that sometimes comes from a sleepless night. The world seemed sharper somehow, each detail more vivid, as if my senses had decided that if this was to be my last day of freedom, such as it was, I should experience it with heightened awareness. The household was in controlled chaos. Servants rushed about with final preparations. Flowers arrived from London. The small chapel on the grounds was being decorated for tomorrow's ceremony. Everyone had a purpose, a task, a clear understanding of their role in the inevitable march toward my union with Julian Valerius. Everyone except me. I dressed mechanically and made my way downstairs, driven by some instinct I could not name. The breakfast room was empty. Julian and my father had gone to the village on some errand related to the wedding. I was informed by a passing maid. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt unmoored, drifting through a house that had become familiar, but would soon be forbidden to me. I found myself walking towards the library without conscious decision, drawn there by weeks of habit and something deeper, a need to be in the place where everything had changed between us, the place where Kaelen and I had discovered we understood each other in ways that defied logic and propriety. He was there. Of course he was there, standing by the window with his back to the door, his posture rigid with tension, staring out at the grounds as if they held answers to questions he had not yet articulated. He did not turn when I entered, though I knew he must have heard me. We had developed an awareness of each other over these weeks, an ability to sense the other's presence without looking. I closed the door behind me. Propriety be damned, we were past the point where open doors and chaperones mattered. The soft click of the latch made him turn, and what I saw in his face stole my breath. The careful control was gone. The Ice Duke had melted entirely, leaving behind a man who looked as if he had not slept any better than I had, who carried the weight of some internal struggle in every line of his body. We stood there, on opposite sides of the library that had been our sanctuary, and the silence between us was deafening. I spoke first, because I had to, because if I did not say something, anything, I would shatter into pieces right there on his expensive carpet. I told him I had come to thank him, that despite the circumstances of my arrival and captivity, the weeks here had been, I struggled for the right word, significant, that I would carry them with me, whatever came next. It was a careful speech, designed to acknowledge what had passed between us without actually naming it, a coward's goodbye, wrapped in gratitude and politeness. He listened with that absolute stillness that had once intimidated me and now simply broke my heart. When I finished, he did not respond immediately. Instead, he crossed the room, with deliberate steps until he stood before me, closer than propriety allowed, close enough that I could see the storm in his eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was rough and raw, and nothing like the measured tones of the Duke of Valerius. He told me he had made a mistake, a catastrophic error in judgment that went against everything he believed about duty and honor and responsibility. I waited, barely breathing, while he continued. He had assumed, he said, that his role was clear. Keep me safe until the wedding, ensure the family alliance, maintain the Valerius honour. Simple, straightforward, a matter of doing what was expected and right. He had not anticipated that I would prove to be unlike any woman he had ever encountered. That conversations meant to pass the time would become the most intellectually stimulating exchanges of his life. That my stubbornness and wit and refusal to be diminished would captivate him entirely. That somewhere between my arrival as his furious captive and this morning, he had committed the ultimate betrayal of his nephew and his family and his own ironclad principles. He had fallen in love with Julian's intended bride. The words hung in the air between us, devastating in their honesty. I felt tears prick my eyes. Whether from joy or despair or the sheer impossibility of it all, I could not say. Before I could respond, he continued, the words tumbling out now as if a dam had broken. He told me he had spent the past week trying to convince himself it was merely attraction, or intellectual fascination, or the result of enforced proximity. That with distance and time these feelings would fade to something manageable. But he could not lie to himself any more. What he felt was not temporary or superficial, or something that would conveniently disappear after I married his nephew. It was profound and consuming and entirely inappropriate, and it was destroying him. He had spent his entire adult life doing the right thing, the honourable thing, putting duty above personal desire. He had sacrificed his own wants for family obligation time and again, and now he found himself facing a choice that had no right answer. Honour his commitment to Julian and his family, or honour the truth of what existed between us. His voice broke slightly on those last words, and I saw the Duke of Ice completely undone before me, vulnerable in a way I suspected few people had ever witnessed. I should have been strong, should have told him that we must do our duty, that honour demanded we ignore these inconvenient feelings, that I would marry Julian as planned, and we would both learn to live with what might have been. But I had spent my entire life doing what was expected, being the daughter and the lady and the obedient piece in other people's plans, and I found I had no strength left for more denial. So instead, I told him the truth. I told him that I had fallen in love with him too, that every debate we had shared, every moment of understanding, every revelation of the complexity beneath his cold exterior had drawn me deeper, that I had come to this house desperate to escape, and now the thought of leaving, of never seeing him again, of spending my life with a man who could never challenge me the way Kaelen did, was unbearable, that I understood duty and honour as well as he did, and I knew what we felt was impossible and wrong, and would hurt people we cared about. But I was tired of being reasonable, tired of denying what my heart knew to be true. I loved him, wholly, desperately, inconveniently, and I did not know what to do about it either. The confession hung between us, raw and honest and terrifying. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Kaelen closed the remaining distance between us with 2 quick steps, and his hands came up to frame my face with a gentleness that contradicted the intensity in his eyes. He told me he could not do this, could not give me to Julian, could not stand beside them tomorrow in that chapel and watch me promise my life to another man, knowing that I should have been his, that the thought of it was destroying him more surely than any scandal or family disapproval ever could. But he would not trap me, would not use my captivity or the circumstances of our situation to pressure me into choosing him. If I wanted to proceed with the wedding to Julian, he would step aside. He would let me go, even if it killed him. He would give me the choice he should have offered weeks ago, the freedom to decide my own future. I could marry Julian as planned. The alliance would proceed, my father's debts would be settled, propriety would be maintained. Julian would be kind to me, and I would have a comfortable life as his wife. Or I could choose differently, choose him, choose scandal and family rupture and social consequences neither of us could fully predict. Choose a man who challenged me and infuriated me and understood me in ways no one else ever had. Choose love over duty, passion over propriety, truth over convenience. But the choice, he said with devastating sincerity, had to be mine. He would not influence it, would not plead his case further. Whatever I decided he would accept. His hands were still framing my face, his thumbs gently brushing away tears I had not realized were falling. His eyes searched mine, and in them I saw everything, love and fear and desperate hope and the willingness to let me go if that was what I chose. I had spent weeks as his prisoner, held in this house against my will, and now, in this moment, he was offering me absolute freedom, the power to choose my own path, whatever the cost. The irony was not lost on either of us. I looked at this impossible man, this duke who had kidnapped me and then somehow set me free, who valued duty above all things yet was willing to abandon it for me, who had shown me what it meant to be truly seen and valued and loved, and my choice became suddenly blazingly clear. I had fled one, prison-seeking freedom. I had found it in the most unexpected place, in the arms of my captor, who had never really held me captive at all. I told him I chose him, us. Whatever came next, whatever consequences we would face, whatever scandal would surely follow. I chose the man who made me want to be braver, smarter, more fully myself. I chose love over duty, even though duty had ruled both our lives until this moment. I chose Kaelen Valerius, and I would face the world's judgment without regret. Something broke in his carefully controlled expression, relief and joy, and something almost like pain. He pulled me closer, his forehead resting against mine, and for a long moment we simply breathed together, anchoring ourselves in the reality of what we had just decided. Then he kissed me, and it was nothing like the chaste courtship kisses I had imagined from Julian. It was desperate and tender and full of weeks of denied longing, and it felt like coming home to a place I had never known I was searching for. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, he told me we needed to speak with Julian and my father immediately, that there was no good way to deliver this news, but delaying would only make it worse, that he would take full responsibility, would face whatever consequences came. I agreed, though my hands were shaking. We were about to shatter multiple lives with our choice. There would be anger and hurt and scandal beyond anything either of us had experienced. But as I looked at Kaelen, at the man I loved, who loved me enough to offer me freedom even when he wanted desperately for me to stay, I knew we were making the right choice. Sometimes the best decisions are the hardest ones. Sometimes duty must bow to truth. And sometimes the greatest freedom comes from choosing the path everyone says is wrong. We walked toward the drawing room together, ready to face whatever came next, together. The walk from the library to the drawing room was simultaneously the longest and shortest journey of my life. Each step brought us closer to a confrontation that would change everything. Yet I found myself wishing we could slow time, extend this moment of solidarity before the storm broke over us. Kaelen's hand found mine as we walked, his fingers interlacing with my own in a gesture of support and solidarity. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say to each other. We had made our choice, and now we would face its consequences together. Julian and my father had returned from the village and were taking tea in the drawing room, discussing some detail about tomorrow's ceremony with the easy comfort of men confident in the smooth progression of their plans. They looked up when we entered, and I watched comprehension dawn slowly on both their faces as they registered our joined hands, the determination in Kaelen's expression, the evidence of tears on my cheeks. My father stood first, his face darkening with confusion that was rapidly shifting toward anger. Julian simply stared, his teacup frozen halfway to his lips, looking between his uncle and his intended bride with dawning understanding. Kaelen spoke before either of them could. His voice was steady, measured, but carried an undercurrent of steel I had rarely heard from him. He told them there would be no wedding tomorrow, that he was deeply sorry for the pain and inconvenience this would cause, but he could not in good conscience allow the ceremony to proceed. My father erupted predictably, demanding to know what absurdity this was, reminding Kaelen of the agreements made, the financial arrangements already in place, the scandal that would result from calling off the wedding at this late hour. His face had gone red with fury and what I recognized as panic. My marriage to Julian was supposed to resolve his financial difficulties, and now that solution was evaporating before his eyes. I found my voice, then stepping forward to face my father directly. I told him that I would not marry Julian, that I was sorry for any embarrassment or difficulty this caused, but I could not promise my life to one man while loving another, that I understood there would be consequences and I was prepared to face them. My father's rage shifted to me, calling me ungrateful, foolish, selfish, demanding to know who had turned my head, what scandal I had engaged in under this roof. His words grew increasingly harsh, and I felt myself beginning to waver under the assault. Then Kaelen stepped forward, placing himself partially between my father and me, his presence a shield. When he spoke, his voice had gone dangerously quiet, the tone of a duke who would tolerate no further disrespect towards someone he valued. He informed my father that any insults directed at me would be considered insults to him personally, that I had conducted myself with perfect propriety during my stay at Valerius Manor, that the fault, if fault there was, lay entirely with him for developing feelings that went beyond his role as guardian of the wedding arrangements. And then he delivered the statement that silenced my father's protests. He intended to marry me himself. The words fell into the drawing room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through everyone present. My father looked as if he had been struck, and Julian, sweet, forgettable Julian, finally set down his teacup with trembling hands. But when Julian spoke, his words surprised us all. He was not angry, he said quietly. Hurt, yes, and embarrassed certainly, but not angry. He had suspected, he admitted, that something had shifted between his uncle and me. He had seen it in the way we avoided looking at each other at dinner, in the careful distance Kaelen had maintained, in my obvious unhappiness when we discussed our future together. He had even, he confessed with a rueful smile, felt some relief at the prospect of this wedding being cancelled. He had agreed to the marriage because it was expected, because it would benefit both families, because his uncle had advised it was a good match. But he had known from our first meeting that I was far too vibrant, too intelligent, too passionate for someone like him. He would never have been able to keep pace with me, and he suspected we both would have been quietly miserable for years. His uncle, on the other hand, was perhaps the only man Julian knew who could match me properly, who would appreciate my sharp mind rather than being intimidated by it, who needed someone exactly like me to challenge the rigid control he imposed on every aspect of his life. Julian turned to Kaelen and told him that he would not stand in the way, though he wished his uncle had realized his feelings before Julian's hopes had been engaged. To me, he offered surprising kindness, a wish that we would be happy together. Even if our happiness came at the cost of his temporary humiliation, I felt tears spring to my eyes at this unexpected grace. Julian was a better man than I had given him credit for, and I told him so. That I was sorry for any hurt we had caused him, and I hoped he would find someone who could love him as he deserved, with wholehearted devotion rather than resigned duty. He accepted this with a sad smile, excused himself from the room with quiet dignity, and left us to face my father's continued protests. But my father's arguments had lost their teeth. Without Julian's opposition, without the wronged party demanding satisfaction, he had no leverage beyond his paternal authority, and we all knew I had stopped recognizing that authority the night I climbed out my bedroom window. Kaelen addressed the financial arrangements with typical efficiency. He would ensure my father's debts were settled, he said coolly, as they had been promised to be upon my marriage into the Valerius family. That promise would be honoured, regardless of which Valerius I married. Furthermore, he would provide a generous settlement that would secure my father's future comfort, on the condition that he accept our union without further protest or attempts to interfere. My father, faced with the choice between financial ruin and accepting his daughter's scandalous marriage to a duke, chose pragmatism over paternal outrage. He agreed with poor Grace, demanded the arrangements be put in writing immediately, and made it clear that he expected us to deal with the social consequences of our actions without involving him further. I accepted this coldness from my father with less pain than I might have expected. We had never been close, and his primary interest in me had always been financial. At least now that was settled with honesty rather than pretense. After my father departed to nurse his wounded pride and count his unexpected windfall, Kaelen and I stood alone in the drawing room once more. The crisis had passed. The worst was over. We were free to choose each other without the weight of obligation to others. The relief should have been immediate and complete. Instead, I found myself trembling with the magnitude of what we had just done, what we were committing ourselves to. Kaelen drew me into his arms, holding me close while I processed the enormity of it all. He told me softly that we would face scandal, certainly, that there would be gossip and social consequences neither of us could fully avoid, that some doors would close to us, some invitations would cease, Some members of the ton would view our marriage as improper regardless of its legality. But we would face it together, he said, against my hair, and he would spend the rest of his life ensuring I never regretted choosing him. I pulled back enough to look into his face. This severe, beautiful, impossible man who had stolen my freedom and somehow given me more of it than I had ever possessed. I told him I could never regret choosing truth over comfortable lies, passion over tepid, contentment, love over duty. We were married 3 weeks later in a quiet ceremony with few witnesses. The scandal, as predicted, was magnificent. The ton had much to say about the Duke of Valerius stealing his nephew's intended bride, about my shameless behaviour, about the impropriety of it all. Invitations to certain events dried up immediately. Some of my father's acquaintances cut me directly when we encountered them in London. I discovered I did not care nearly as much as I had feared I might. Because I had Kaelen, and he had me, and together we had something far more valuable than social approval. We had genuine partnership, intellectual equality, passionate debate, and love that had been tested by impossible circumstances and emerged stronger for it. Julian, I was pleased to learn, recovered from his brief heartbreak with remarkable speed. Within 6 months, he had become engaged to a sweet-natured young woman who collected coins with the same enthusiasm he did, and who listened to his lengthy explanations about ancient currency with genuine fascination. They seemed, by all accounts, perfectly suited and thoroughly content with their ordinary happiness. As for me, I became the Duchess of Valerius, a role I had never sought but found myself embracing with unexpected enthusiasm. I discovered that being a duchess provided certain freedoms, the ability to speak my mind more openly, to pursue intellectual interests without censure, to challenge the social conventions that had always chafed against my nature. And I had a partner who not only tolerated my rebellious spirit, but actively encouraged it. Our library became famous among a select circle of intellectuals and reformers, a place where ideas could be debated freely, and women's voices were valued equally with men's. We hosted salons that scandalized the traditional ton and delighted the more progressive thinkers. We argued passionately about politics and philosophy over breakfast, and sometimes those arguments continued well into the night. It was everything a proper duchess's life should not be, and everything I had never known I wanted. On our first anniversary, as we sat together in the library where so much had changed between us, Kaelen asked if I ever regretted my choice, if I ever wished I had chosen the easier path, the comfortable marriage to Julian, the social acceptance, the quiet life of propriety and convention. I looked at this man who challenged me daily to be braver, smarter, more fully myself, who had given me the freedom to choose when he could have kept me captive to duty, who loved me not despite my sharp edges but because of them. I told him the truth. I had been kidnapped by the coldest duke in England, held prisoner in his manor, denied my freedom and my choice, and in that captivity I had found something I had been searching for my entire life without knowing it, a partner who saw me completely and loved me anyway, a man who made duty seem less important than truth, and who had chosen me over everything he had been taught to value. I had fled my father's house seeking freedom, and I had found it in the most unexpected place, in the arms of the man who had first taken my freedom away, only to give it back tenfold by letting me choose him freely. So no, I told my husband, the Duke of Valerius, the man I had chosen over duty and propriety and social approval. I did not regret my choice, not for a single moment. I had been the ransom, it turned out, but I had also been the prize, and so had he. We had both been prisoners, him to duty, me to others' expectations, and we had freed each other by choosing love over everything else that should have mattered more but somehow did not. It was scandalous and improper and absolutely perfect, and I would not have changed a single moment of it.